Hitchens.
Oh,
He
cool.
called in from the UK, and the sound was terrible. It was like I got this really awesome guy on, but the sound just got ruined, and I was so bad. It was so sad. So now every time before I like, hey guys, does the sound work? Please let me know, just to make
Uh,
sure.
he just recently died, didn't he?
Peter Hitchens, did he? I don't think so.
No. Okay. This is the God is not great guy.
Oh, it's Christopher Hitchens. That's his brother. Christopher
Oh,
Hitchens died. So I invited on his theistic brother who believes in God, and he came on my show and we talked about it.
I love it.
Yeah,
All right, I'm gonna have to look that up now.
yeah, absolutely. So yeah, okay, sound is good. So Dr. Waller, thanks for coming on and be willing to have a conversation with me. Would you mind telling us a little bit about yourself before we get started?
Oh, thank you very much for inviting me. I love the show. Um, yeah, I'm a philosopher at Kenyon College in Gambier, Ohio. I teach courses in metaphysics, but also in legal theory. I did my PhD at Purdue University, where I studied Spinoza. I've written two books on, you know, everyone's favorite Jewish atheist. Then I became really interested in fine tuning arguments, and I spent about 7 years doing basically nothing but researching fine tuning. That culminated in a book published last year. And since then, I've moved on to legal theory. And so now my current
This
work
one,
is
right?
all about interpretation. So,
Yeah.
yes, excellent. Though in the year, I'm told the paperback will come out, which will be a lot cheaper than the hardback. So, either get it in the e format or wait for the paperback because the hardback's ridiculously expensive.
Yeah. But it's nice. I do. I like the feel of it. It's nice. It's not like because some papers I've read some books and they like dry out your hands and it feels really bad. Now I really like your book. It feels nice.
Yeah, they did a good job with the printing. I was really happy with that.
So you think that the fine tuning argument is indicative of the existence of a god of some kind, correct?
Yeah, so let me give a sort of outline. So, of course, I teach modern philosophy a lot, and we read Hume. And the general consensus, I think, in the philosophical community is that Hume's arguments against a fine tuner or a designer are essentially decisive. And the community has more or less moved on. It considers the argument uninteresting. Now, there's, of course, a small band, maybe of 10% of theistic philosophers still, but the overwhelming majority of the philosophical community has decided quite a while ago that this is not a viable path and has just moved on. But the more I taught it and the more I thought about it, the more I was like, well, you could just reformulate the argument in this way or this way, and then you would avoid Hume's problems. So then I began to worry that maybe the community was wrong. And so I went looking for fine tuning material. And of course, there's hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of articles. So I had some students collect all of them, organize them for me, and we read everything that I could find, and I thought through it, and I became convinced that each of the potential objections could be avoided by simply changing some part of the argument, right? Making the argument stronger or weaker in some way. Um, so then so then that began the project of the book I was writing. Chapter 3, for example, is just a collection of the most common objections and responses to them. That was really where I started because the idea was, well, if one of these objections is decisive, game over and we should do something else. This isn't a viable project. But none of these I thought worked. So then there's other big questions. There's questions about how to do the mathematics. There's questions about what we mean by fine tuning. There's questions about the interpretation of the science, right? What if we're a straight instrumentalist? Then that doesn't work. And then there's broader questions about how we should even approach metaphysical questions in general. And here's where I think I may depart from a lot of my colleagues, which is I'm very skeptical of metaphysical arguments, right? Of rational arguments. I think that a priori argument in metaphysics can justify a belief, um, but given the terrible track record of metaphysical arguments over the past 2,000 years, I think we should be very, very skeptical, right? For that reason, then I want to take beliefs that we have a really good reason to believe in, and use those to frame the space where we can have metaphysical discussions. So the ones most important for this book I'll take are our best scientific theories are approximately true. Okay. Now, again, there's always room for advancement, and they're not all consistent with each other, and blah blah blah. Okay, but I mean, like, we have a basic understanding of how the universe works. I'm assuming some kind of scientific realism. So we need to assume that the universe, that we are in fact thinking about the universe. So we're not Kantians, right? Where the universe, where all we know about is our own experiences, and we can know nothing about the world. Okay, well, if that's true, then game over. We can't prove anything about fine tuning or cosmology, for that matter. And then most controversially is our modal intuitions, right? Our modal beliefs. These are beliefs about what is not what is actual, but what is possible or necessary. Um, I think modal thinking is so deeply entwined in almost every aspect of um, of our thinking, right? Anytime you're talking about anything other than what exists, right? You're doing modal thinking, so all conditional reasoning, stuff like this. And the um, but the question of, like, how do you justify a modal belief, right? Would be, well, look, I can easily imagine it being different, right? Is it physically possible for there to be a tiger in the room right now? Sure, right? Well, how do you know that? Well, I mean, it's easy to imagine bringing a tiger into the room, and I can't imagine every detail. I don't know what color the tiger's eyes are. I don't know how many furs he has, or whether his kidneys are functioning correctly. But, like, I get enough of a conception that I think it justifies my belief that is physically possible. Well, can I have a tiger in the room and not a tiger in the room at the same time, right? Well, at this point, I can't even conceptually think about what that would look like. And so I want to say, no, that's not even possible. Not physically impossible. That's metaphysically impossible. Like, that's like literally incoherent, right? So I want to take our considered modal judgments as framing our metaphysical discussion, right? If you go way outside of our metaphysical, of our modal understandings, then you're going to call into doubt lots of perfectly ordinary reasoning about daily life, legal reasoning, reasoning about scientific reasoning is often modal. And then at that point, I say, oh, what's your reasoning? What's your argument for so radically undermining our modal beliefs? And what it's going to be is some sort of metaphysical speculative argument. And at that point, I think I have more faith in the science and the practical and the legal than I do in whatever your modal skeptical argument is, or something like this. And so I want to take our considered modal beliefs as true until we have good reason to think otherwise in a particular case. Okay, so I don't think we're infallible when it comes to our modal beliefs. Okay, so I've outlined sort of a conservative methodology in metaphysics where we take the things that we think we know as constraints on our metaphysical speculations. And for our purposes, the things that are most important are going to be scientific theories, scientific realism, and our modal beliefs. Given that background, I think some of the options for fine tuning fall off the table as yielding such radical changes to our other beliefs that I just don't think metaphysical arguments are up to the task of doing that.
Well, could you tell me, well, instead of ruling out alternatives, especially since most of the alternatives I wouldn't agree with either, could you tell me why you think they do indicate a God of some kind? And by God, we're talking about just not necessarily the Christian God. We're just talking about more of a generic kind of a God, just a personal being with a mind of some kind that's extremely powerful.
Yeah, sure. Well, I want to take this in two parts. Okay, so feel free to interrupt me at any time here. First, I want to talk about the classical cosmological fine tuning, and this is where the literature has been for 40 years. There's lots of constants in the laws of nature that we just have to discover empirically. Scientists have then argued that if these constants were just slightly different, then the universe wouldn't have life in it, wouldn't look anything like it does now. Luke Barnes has a book, The Fortunate Universe, which I think is the best exposition of this topic. There's an older book on the anthropological, cosmological principle from 30 years ago, which goes into way too much depth if you really want to like hardcore it. But there's a bunch of these coincidences, okay? And the question then is like, can you infer anything interesting from that, right? And there seems to be a relatively small number of options, right? It could be a coincidence, okay, right? I mean, it could just be chance, right? If it didn't work out that way, we wouldn't be here to ask the question anyway. And so maybe that seems to reduce the improbability of the chance option. It could not be a coincidence because perhaps there's some sort of designer, right, that intended the universe to have life among other things. And so it wasn't random at all, right? Or it could be that there are many, many different universes, and the fundamental constants are take different values in the different universes, right? Until and then so the probability that one of them would come out correct is very high, and of course we're in that one or in one of those. For example, the mass of the proton in relationship to the mass of the neutron, right? The mass of the proton is slightly, arbitrarily less massive than the neutron. Because of this, neutrons decay into protons. Okay? If it had gone the other way, and there's currently no explanation or no even hint of what could count as an explanation for this fact. If it had gone the other way, and neutrons had been slightly less massive than protons, then in the very early universe, when things were moving apart very quickly, the electrons that were flying around would not have been attracted to the neutrons. All the protons would quickly have decayed into neutrons. And so you'd have a universe containing almost entirely neutron black holes. Okay. So there's one particular example of like, well, that's interesting. Why did that happen, right? If the quantity of matter energy at the moment of the Big Bang had been just slightly higher or slightly lower, there would be nothing, right? Too high, and the matter would have been blown apart so quickly that it couldn't have formed into galaxies and planets. I'm sorry, I got confused. If the quantity of matter energy was higher, then it would have recollapsed very quickly. And if it was slightly less, then it would have blown out so quickly that galaxies could not have formed, right? So again, you're like, wow, that's really interesting. The quantity of matter energy in our universe seems to be an arbitrary number. Why did it just happen to come out correctly, right? Okay, sorry, I'm just sort of explaining the problem here, right? Okay, so we have our different options. Maybe it was random, maybe there's lots of universes, maybe it was a god, right? These have been the options that people have been fighting over for a long time, and the bulk of the book concerns these arguments. Fast forward, my conclusion here is that theism is a plausible explanation. It's a viable explanation. The objections to the theistic inference, I think, are mistaken. But also, I think a multiverse account is a viable explanation as well. And the objections to multiverse theory, or the inference to multiverse theory, I think don't work either. So I think you have two alternatives that, so far as I can see from a metaphysical point of view, seem to be roughly equally matched. Now, you're a metaphysician. You have two options. Do you believe in a huge number of universes, or do you believe in a weird single entity that's totally unlike any other kind of entity, right? Well, which is theoretically better? Well, neither of them is confirmable, right? Neither of them yields testable predictions, right? Bummer. Which one's simpler? Well, theism seems to be quantitatively simpler. I only posit one more entity, God, right? or godlike thing. But the multiverse theory seems to be qualitatively simpler because you only need one kind of thing, right? David Lewis famously argues that he doesn't care how many instances of something there are, but as long as there's only one kind of thing, he thinks that's way more plausible than offering two kinds of things. Swinburne, on the other hand, argues, no, God is so simple that it's the simplest possible thing. Swinburne says he gives it a prior probability of 0.5, which is staggering, and then says, no, positing the absolute simplest thing is way better than David Lewis's infinite number of universes that are also possible worlds. So I don't know how to answer that. I having spent many hours laying on the couch staring at the ceiling, I've got nothing on which is actually better. I think this involves deep metaphysical intuitions, and I just don't see a way past that. So my conclusion in the first part of the book is going to be that these are two viable, roughly equally good explanations. And all of the objections that each side has thrown at the other, I think, have been largely unsuccessful.
I actually wanted to ask you about one of those because in your book you mentioned the one example of seeing the crop circles, and we can either say there's a large number of jokesters or that there's aliens. And it seems more reasonable to say it's probably the large number of jokesters because we know jokesters can do this. So why wouldn't we just infer more jokesters as opposed to this new kind of a thing which is completely separate from our current understanding? It seems like most people's intuitions would lean towards the jokesters. Why would that not apply in this case of the God?
Well, let's take, yeah. So I completely agree with your reasoning here. And in fact, I would say don't add any new kinds of entities into your ontology unless you're really forced to do so, right? If we can explain everything in naturalistic terms, right, then there's no reason, I think, theoretical reason to posit any sort of supernatural design. So we're looking at crop circles, right? And we come up with hypotheses. And I think now what matters is really going to be your priors, right? What are my prior probability for aliens? What is my prior probability for jokesters, right? Well, I know jokesters exist, and I know people can do this and such. And so, I mean, my prior is going to overwhelmingly win on this case. Now, if it was done in such a way that it was physically impossible for humans to do it, right? So that there was only, say, two options, right? Where your two options were each of the stalks of the field fell over by random chance into this pattern all at the same time through independent causes, right? Or an alien spaceship landed. And if those are literally my only two options, which is the most probable inference? And at that point, I want to say, it's pretty unlikely that all the stalks would fall over by random chance into a particular pattern all at the same time. And so I think the most reasonable inference at that point would be an alien spaceship landing based on the prior probability. Like, what's the prior probability that there are aliens who land? Very low. Is it zero? Oh, it's certainly not zero, right? But it's low. And I would say, but the probability of the stalks falling over, right, by random chance is lower, right, for most of us. And so I think the reasonable inference is to draw it would be aliens in that context.
Okay, and then you wanted to move on to the modal version of the fine tuning.
Good. So I think we're at a draw. So then I try to, heroically break the stalemate with a new argument, which is going to be somewhat involved. So I'm going to presuppose a certain amount of background in possible worlds. Is that reasonable, Tom?
Yeah, absolutely. A lot of the people who watch my show are pretty familiar with philosophy, so they pretty much know a lot of this stuff.
Excellent. I want to argue that possible worlds are fine-tuned, and that we can make a fine-tuning argument at the level of possible worlds. Here's how that works. Imagine, say, the set of all possible worlds, or the collection of all possible worlds. We can now rank, make a distance relationship among them by sort of counting the number of atomic changes that you would have to make to the world to make it exactly identical, indistinguishable from another world. Okay, so the more atomic changes you have to make, the farther away the world is. Okay, from another possible world. Okay, and of course, a possible world is the complete way that things could be. If there are lots of universes, then they're all within a single possible world. Okay, don't confuse universe with possible world; two completely different concepts. Okay, we worked this out in much more detail with a mathematician, brilliant mathematician friend of mine in the book, but that's the basic idea. More atomic changes, the further they are apart. Okay, fine. Now let's take an arbitrarily large finite number. I think we pick 10 to the 500th or 10,000th or some ridiculously large but finite number. And let me say that all of the, let me pick a particular world and say that all of the worlds within that, say 100, million changes, all bear a certain similarity relationship to that world. Okay. So then what I want to do is say, divide up the space of all possible worlds into these balls of worlds with a world in the center, and then all the worlds within, n changes. Then we'll move somewhere else, and then we'll make another ball. Okay, and we'll move somewhere else and make another ball. You can do this mathematically so we can guarantee the balls do not overlap. Let's say that the center of one of the balls is the actual world. Okay. So then you have a certain subset of the possible worlds that are similar to the actual world, meaning that they are within n changes to the atomic structure or atomic states of affairs or whatever, to the actual world. Okay, those subset of worlds I want to call alpha similar. Okay, those are worlds that are alpha similar, and this will work for any finite number n. Okay, so the n is just sort of arbitrarily chosen. Are you with me so far on this?
Yep. But why is this important? Why is the idea that possible worlds are finely tuned? Why is that important?
It's important because it allows me to give you a fine-tuning argument at the level of possible worlds, and doing that is going to rule out one of our two options. It's going to rule out the multiverse option, unless you want to be a modal realist, which I think I rule out on methodological grounds. Right. So you have, say, alpha similar worlds. Now we recognize, of course, the actual world is alpha similar. Why is that? And now I think we have a question exactly analogous to the question of the fine-tuning of our universe for life. But now we have a possible world fine-tuned for alpha similarity. And so now the question is, well, why is the actual world alpha similar as opposed to any of the infinite number of other kinds of similarity? It's not. Okay, look at your options, right? In the book, I argue your two best options for the cosmological are a multiverse or a theism. We make the same argument at the level of possible worlds. We now have a multiverse.
Sorry, so because you said the multiverse or atheism.
Yeah.
So multiverse or theism, right? Not because atheism.
Oh, I'm sorry. Or some theism or other.
Yes, the multiverse or atheism. I like it.
And you're like, I'm with you.
All right. Debate over. I've won. Everyone, bye-bye.
Game over, right? Or some theism or other, right? Now, of course, we're at the level of possible worlds. So one way to say, hey, why is the actual world alpha similar? Oh, because all the possible worlds exist, right? Claiming that only a subset of the actual possible worlds exist, I think, is a truly bizarre position that no one has defended. But all possible worlds actually exist, and so of course the actual world exists. This view, which of course is defended by David Lewis, has so many counterintuitive consequences that I want to rule it out, that I'm unconvinced on methodological grounds, right? At the beginning, I talked about methodological conservatism. I don't care how persuasive your argument is that every possible way things could be is actual. I'm more persuaded of my modal intuitions and the true strangeness of the David Lewis worldview that I'm just going to rule that one out. Interestingly, Alex Proust argued in his doctoral dissertation that there are set theoretic problems with modal realism. He also argued, interestingly, that there are moral problems with modal realism. If you have an infinite number of counterparts, You may have an obligation to hurt yourself so they don't hurt themselves. Okay. Anyway, the view is truly strange. Okay. Rule out modal realism. Now it seems your only option is theism, right? Why is the actual world alpha similar? Well, because there's some sort of being who wanted uh, an alpha similar world for reasons that are unknown to us. But then you say, wait a minute, there is an additional option. Maybe it was chance, right? Maybe all the possible worlds are out there and I don't know, nature through nature, there is nothing, nothingness through a dart, and it just hit the actual world, right? Maybe it's just brute chance. Okay, but now we have a problem, right? If it is random chance, well, what is the probability that if the actual, which possible world became actual occurred by chance? What is the probability that it would become an alpha similar world?
Like the example with the aliens causing the crop circles. Why would all of the crop circles fall over by random chance?
You got it. Except this one's actually going to be, I think, an infinitely lower probability. I think that the probability is going to be arbitrarily close to 1 over infinite, which of course makes no sense. So it's going to be arbitrarily close to 0. It's not literally impossible, but it's as close to impossible as you can get without being impossible. Okay.
All right, so let me rephrase your argument so far and make sure in a short-term version.
Good.
So essentially, we have the fine-tuning of the universe, which is the fact that if we change any of the constants slightly, then it will no longer be life-permitting, and in a drastic way, like the particles will either fly apart too fast or collapse too quickly to produce essentially anything like what we see in the universe. And if we think of that as in kind of the multiverse kind of a way, well, then you have a further, an additional fine-tuning problem, which is who fine-tuned the possible worlds? Like, why are those fine-tuned? And this is the part where I think the same thing kind of applies to a god. So let's say the universe was fine tuned by a god. Well, who fine tuned God to create this kind of a universe? Because it seems just like there are infinitely many alpha possible variations on our possible world, there could be equally or more infinitely many possible ways to define a god. Like there could be a god who wanted only hydrogen atoms or only astatine molecules or only black holes or didn't want anything, just a universe of nothing and he just didn't produce anything. So it seems like I can apply your same reasoning to who fine-tuned the multiverse to who fine-tuned God. So it seems like it would rule out both for the same reason. I don't see why this would indicate theism.
Yeah, no, yeah, excellent point. I think what you're going to need here is if theism is going to do the theoretical job that it needs to do in explaining why the actual world is alpha similar, then I think the being that we're positing has to exist necessarily. It can't be a contingent being for exactly the reason you indicate. If it's contingent and this possible world just happens to contain an alpha similar loving God, right? Then, oh, well, then we just have exactly the same fine tuning problem at the level of a being of a creator. At that point, just cut the creator. He's not doing any theoretical work for you, and just have a random possible world. Game over, right? I mean, there's no theoretical advantage unless you need him to explain some fact in the actual world or something. But if you do, okay, well, the being is metaphysically necessary. So it exists in all possible worlds. Now, what are my costs here? My costs are certain possible worlds that I thought could exist can't. Intuitively, I would say there's an empty possible world. But if there's a necessary being, there is no empty possible world, right? There's just the smallest possible world has this being and nothing else. Okay. I might, yeah. So I'm going to have to give.
Let me pick up on that. So let's say that you can grant that there is a necessary being. Well, why can't I just say that there is a necessary natural thing without the consciousness? Because it seems like I can just apply the same thing. And instead of positing a multiverse, I can just say there's this unknown quantum particle that exists outside of space-time, which is a necessary thing in and of itself without any kind of a mind. And it can explain the fine-tuning. So it seems like I could apply that same reasoning to a natural case, kind of like the multiverse, but just a quantum particle, to get the same kind of qualitative result.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. Let's say instead of theism, maybe I could just posit the existence of a necessary natural thing that just happened to result in an alpha similar world. Well, now here's the problem. The only way you're going to get that is your necessary natural thing either created an actual world by necessity, right? It had to do so. At which point, the alpha, our actual world is necessary. At which point, there's only one possible world. At which point, we're all Spinozists, and our modal intuitions are bunk. And okay, at that point, my conservatism says, yeah, I'm off. I get off the train. Or your necessary natural thing worked by random chance to create an actual world. So if you're going to get a contingent actual world, I think your only options are randomness or free will.
Well, let me pick up on that. So I usually make the same argument to theists, and their response is that, well, God didn't make the decision randomly. He has a certain kind of a nature which prevents a certain category of choices. But he didn't make it determined. So he wasn't determined to make one option. He has a space of options he can make, and of those spaces, he essentially chose one of those options. And I think I can replicate this in a natural kind of a way with essentially like quantum particles. We know quantum particles have an infinite range where they can decay, and they only decay in a specific part of that range. So we can produce the same kind of a limitation where it's not purely random. It can only exist within a range, and it's not determined because it is going to end up somewhere in that range. So it seems like I can mirror the theistic kind of a God made a decision to make this kind of a universe with the quantum particle doing the same thing without it being either determined or random. It still seems to fit equally in the non-determined random case. Now, specifically on the free will thing, I don't consider free will to be a coherent idea, because I think that
even in our case,
yeah, even in our case, like I don't think that like either anything we
there's more
do.
responsibility.
I don't think so. I think it's completely incoherent. So if you say like I did action X because of free will, well, I could say, okay, so did you do action X for reasons, in which case it's determined by those reasons, or did you do it for no reason, in which case it's random? And so if there's any reason that caused you to do action X, well, then it's going to be determined by those reasons in some sense. And if it has no reasons that determine it at all, well, then it's by definition random. And I don't know of any possible addition to that dichotomy that can get you out of it to allow free will to be a thing.
Yeah, let me respond to that quickly here. I agree that free will is really, really tricky. Okay, but here again, my methodological conservatism steps in. If your argument that you just gave us, which I find highly persuasive, if I adopt that view, then I now have to abandon vast chunks of my web of beliefs, right? I need to give up moral responsibility. I need to give up the fact that I'm choosing, that my phenomenal experience of me choosing to live a certain way is accurate. I need to give up certain possibilities like, hey, I could walk across the room right now, even though I'm not currently doing it.
Well, I mean, I wouldn't necessarily agree with that, because I would take something like Dan Dennett's compatibilism and say that we still have moral responsibility. We still have free will insofar as our brains allow us to do a certain set of things. But it isn't the libertarian kind of free will where it's departing from all deterministic relations to reality. So I would not grant that you have to give up those things unless you make those things specifically contingent on a libertarian free will.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, you could do like Frankfurt, of course, Frankfurt argues, of course, that you can have moral responsibility without the ability to do otherwise. I don't find these particular arguments persuasive. We can jump into that if we want. But so you want to say you do believe in free will, you're just a compatibilist.
Well, because compatibilism is essentially just a variant of determinism. So I believe in a kind of free will, which is a deterministic kind of free will. I don't believe in libertarian free will in that there is this new essence or ontology of free will, which is independent of either the determined random dichotomy. I kind of agree with the theist definition that it can be determined within a range and then random within that range, and that can be called free will in some sense.
Does your compatibilist conception of free will permit moral responsibility then?
Yes, but it's kind of in
So
the same sense.
You're doing a penguin with an axe for fun because it's fun to do so. I'm morally responsible for this barbaric act, right?
Right. I would say
you monster, you were correct.
Right. I would say any killing is wrong under any circumstance. If you kill a penguin for food, I would still call it morally wrong. I think it's morally wrong to kill anything for any reason that has consciousness.
Wow. Okay.
But that's my moral theory. That's a different
okay.
topic.
Yeah. Then you do have to believe in free will, because like if a tree trunk falls over and smashes a penguin, we don't blame the tree trunk morally.
I would actually blame the way nature operates. So that's again, that's more my moral theory. I think that I changed the view on my view on morality is that morality is a description of the best way the world could be, not what we should do or our obligation to do things, but a description of the way, the best moral universe or the best moral way the world could be. And the moral statements like saying you're morally culpable for killing the penguin or whatever
Mhm.
is simply a statement saying our world is moving away or is not going towards that best of all possible worlds. And so you are morally culpable simply because it's it's more of a kind of a descriptive thing about where our relation to the best of all possible worlds is, to steal the Leibnizian term. But that's purely just my moral theory is a different topic. I want to stay on the fine tuning as
Oh,
much as
okay.
possible.
Uh,
But
okay.
so in
We
my
can come back to
view,
that.
I kind of agree with Dan Dennett's interpretation of compatibilism, where we can still have all of the moral responsibility stuff in a either deterministic or random context. And I don't, so I would not agree that you have to give those up while
Okay.
being a determinist or a randomist.
Oh,
But I
great.
would still say that there's no, there, I don't know of any way to express what free will could be. And your argument was the methodological sense that we seem to have this free will intuitively, therefore I'm justified in believing it because we seem to have it.
Well, I would also need to argue that our moral conceptions involve the ability to do otherwise. I don't blame a tree for smashing a penguin because it couldn't do otherwise. I do blame Bob because Bob could have done otherwise. That's the intuitive reasoning. You could talk me out of that and blame the tree or not blame Bob, but that would be a major moral shift in our thinking. So it seems to me as though moral reasoning is intimately tied to a conception that we could have done otherwise. Frankfurt examples are somewhat side topic if we want to run into that.
Okay,
But let me.
I would not consider the moral position as a strong point of evidence because as far as we know, there isn't really a consensus in philosophy about what morality is. It's essentially an open topic right now.
There's a lot of consensus about particular moral beliefs.
Uh,
If I can, I take an infant and cut it open and torture it for fun.
oh
There's,
yeah, but they
I mean,
don't.
there's no more.
They disagree about the whys. Like, what is the standard of morality? So I think you looking at the Phil Survey's paper, I think 51 or 54% of philosophers are moral realists or something like that. But they all have different moral philosophies. There's no like the most one is like 13% on utilitarianism or consequentialism or something. So the moral field right now is super open to interpretation. It's just an unsolved problem, like dark matter or dark energy. I consider it to be in some sense.
Yeah, that it is morally wrong to torture a baby for fun is not controversial. Why it is wrong might be controversial, but I think we can all agree that it is wrong.
Right. And well, then my argument is then that we can get that the why it's wrong without entailing those free will things. We can still have that moral responsibility, like in the Dan Dent sense, or the what was it the guys mentioned you mentioned, Camfort,
Oh, Frankfurt, yeah, he
Frankfurt.
has a famous counterexample.
Right. So there's different people who can interpret morality in such a way that we can still have that without free will. So that doesn't entail free will to have that it's morally wrong to kill a baby. So I don't think that argument follows that because it's morally wrong to kill a baby, therefore we need free will.
Yeah, I do actually think it follows because, let's say, I think it's unfortunate when a baby gets cancer and dies, but I don't think the cancer is morally blameworthy. Like I, and the reason is because I don't think the cancer could do otherwise. If it was consciously choosing to cause this suffering, then I would not only would it be unfortunate, but it would be wrong. Without the ability to do otherwise, I don't see how you can distinguish unfortunate from morally wrong. I think you just end up with everything being unfortunate. Rather,
Or morally wrong.
uh, yeah, I guess you could, but you'd have to shift your concept of morally wrong to like rocks and trees can do morally wrong things.
Yeah,
Now,
that's kind of the approach I take. I think that any involuntary imposition on will. So if a rock falls on you, that's immoral. It's not the rock's fault. It's just
no,
that
wait, hold on.
universe.
Involuntary, uh,
Impositions of will.
which means you believe in will.
Yes, not free will, just will, not free will. Those aren't the
Okay,
same thing.
okay,
So,
okay.
so from my position, that a universe which allows for the possibility for a rock to fall on someone without their consent, is an immoral universe. I think that I would like to say the world itself is immoral in that sense, and there are different worlds who could be more moral because they don't have that option.
Interesting. Yeah, I mean, I would think it's certainly unfortunate if God exists and created the universe, and this suffering exists for no reason, completely randomly. Then I think, although I want to hedge here a little bit, that you could probably say, "Oh, God's choice was immoral." Um, but again, I think you need the choice. But let me run an argument this way. All right, let's go back to possible worlds for a second. The actual world's alpha similar. Let's say we want to choose between two options now. One, it happened by random chance, either uncaused random chance or your naturalistic random chance. Okay. Um, or there exists a necessary being with free will who chose to make an alpha similar world. All right, let's calculate our probabilities. What is the probability that it occurred by chance, arbitrarily close to zero? What's the probability that we live in a universe with a God, or that there is a God who created the actual world? Really low. The evidence here is not very persuasive. It's really difficult to interpret. There's a lot of fraud here. I don't, I'm not confident, but it's not zero, right? So if those are my only two options, then I want to say, because the probability of chance is so low, as long as the probability of theism and belief that libertarian free will is at least coherent, okay, I'll just add that into the hypothesis. As long as that belief is not zero, and I'm right that there are no other options, then we have, I mean, it's clearly something, right? One of the answers has to be correct. And so if that's literally our only option, then you might say, then you have to say, wow, then our best explanation is that there's probably some kind of godlike thing who chose to actualize an alpha similar world.
All right. So far in the argument, I would totally agree with you that if we're just contrasting the way we've portrayed the multiverse as just like, or the many worlds hypothesis or string theory, where just every possible world exists or something, and we contrast that with the God hypothesis, I would say that the God hypothesis is better, given just what we've talked about so far. There are some other objections I would have to the God hypothesis, but if we contrast the God hypothesis to my naturalistic hypothesis, it seems I can get the probabilities to be identical.
Not unless you're so you want a naturalistic cause with a limited range within which there is a random outcome. Correct?
Yes.
Now, why that limited range and not a different one? It's either going to be contingent or necessary.
Right. And that's where I take up on the God hypothesis, where you say God is a necessary being. Then it seems kind of like a brute fact in the sense where you're saying, well, God just has this nature to want to create a life permitting universe. And I can just simply repeat that same line and say, well, this particle has some nature which prefers these kinds of constants. So it seems like I can match both of them on that in that argument.
No, I think you could be making two different claims that are completely different, right? One is that, say, the range of outcomes from the naturalistic cause is metaphysically necessary. Then we need to revise our conception of what is possible. And many of the possible worlds that we thought were possible are actually impossible because of some newly discovered necessary cause. Okay. And
Well, just to interrupt you, I think that's what I'm doing here. So I'm saying, like, if we take the conception of a God that most theists have, like omniscient, omnibenevolent, personal, all-powerful, outside of space and time, whatever.
I don't need all of those. Go ahead.
Oh yeah, right. I'm not accusing you of that, but I'm saying that if we take the atheist who sees that, well, that's nonsense. Like, there's nothing metaphysically necessary about 90% of those properties. We don't need most of them. Like, so if we say, why is goodness even in there? Many atheists don't even think goodness is a thing. Or why is personal in there? That's not necessary to create the universe. I mean, particles could do that. So it seems like many of the properties that are attributed to a God and are said to be entailed in the metaphysical simplicity of the God aren't. They're just kind of like arbitrarily stuck in there. Like if I took the flying spaghetti monster and said, the flying spaghetti monster is the perfectly simple necessary thing, like spaghetti? Really? Like, and we do the same thing with like consciousness. So if we take consciousness and say consciousness is the metaphysically necessary thing, to the atheist that seems just as arbitrary as saying spaghetti is the metaphysically necessary thing. So just so in the same sense that you're applying these what seem to be 6 or so different properties of a God and compiling them into one necessary entity. It seems like we can do the same thing in the case of a particle and say, well, what seems to be separate properties that limit the range of metaphysically possible worlds are actually just entailed in the essence of this particle.
Mhm.
So I'm trying to mirror the argument as much as possible here.
Sure. But I don't think that's going to work. Because consciousness is not arbitrary, right? If I'm really forced down into choosing between randomness or free will, right, to get contingency, if I reject both of those, then it seems as though the actual world is necessary and then everything, and we're all Spinozas again. So to get contingency, I don't see an option other than randomness, either constrained or not constrained, or free choice.
Well, let me just ask about this. So if we say that right now the consensus in philosophy is there is no free will, that's the vast majority.
Oh my
So
goodness, I hope that's not true.
Phil Survey's paper, as far as I can tell, it's like 70% or something, or
I
some
assume they're
large
compatible.
number.
They're not hard determinists.
Oh yeah, yeah, they're not. I mean, they just don't accept the libertarian free will. Like free will is this godly kind of can do otherwise thing.
Sure.
So
There are a lot of compatibilists.
yeah, so that position does not seem to be well supported by the consensus in the field. So I think we have good evidence to, if you're a conscientious observer trying to take this from a perspective of, well, should I take this argument seriously? Well, the vast majority of the people in the field don't really accept that as a strong argument. So it doesn't seem to be a really good basis to conclude that one is more plausible than the other. Is there anything in, for example, physics that would indicate one or the other? Because as far as I know, physics is just essentially a combination of all principles, particles, and laws that we can verify in some way, and no combination of those things can get you free will. We know of no combination that can get that. So if we're just going based off of the naturalistic world as far as we can demonstrate it, nothing would actually indicate a God as opposed to the multiverse. It's only if you add this additional philosophical argument of morality that you can get to the God hypothesis. Is that accurate?
Not quite. Let me make two quick points, right? I'm not claiming that we have libertarian free will. I don't need that claim. All I need actually for the argument at the beginning is that there is a conceptually coherent concept of libertarian free will. Now, what that is, I don't know. I'm just going to add that into the theory of minimal theism, right?
That's something I would have to object to, but go ahead.
Why?
Because again, I can't conceive of it. It's like trying to conceive of a tiger that's in the room and both out of the room. I can conceive of nothing, no coherent definition of free will.
I mean, if you want to say something like, and actually, I think something I said a minute ago is wrong. I do actually probably believe that we have libertarian free will, but I don't think
I'm assuming you do.
For the purpose of this argument.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, if you can say, no, I can prove conclusively that libertarian free will can't exist because it's logically incoherent, then that proof would succeed in disproving any kind of minimal theism as I have defined it. And then at that point, I still want to run my probabilities as, what is the probability that there is an unknown error in your metaphysical proof, or an unrecognized one? And then I would say, let's look at the history here. That strikes me as not zero. If your alternative is essentially a zero probability event, and I have to choose between there exists a minimal theistic God and your argument is flawed in a way I have not yet discovered, or, the actual world came to be by chance, then I still think I go with minimal theism. And Tom, very smart guy, lots of good ideas, but is probably wrong about this particular one.
All right, but I would phrase the argument kind of differently. So I would make the same kind of approach you're doing, that you're asserting a thing that would cause drastic changes to our modal intuitions. Like when I talk about, well, what is free will? And we try to actually articulate it. There are no articulations that can get you free will. Like it always ends up being determined or random or some combination of the two. And so as far as I can tell, if you want to posit this new kind of a thing, which cannot be in any way described by humans, no matter what we do, as anything more than just a raw possibility, that seems to be kind of like saying space-time bends. Like at the time when Einstein made the argument, time was a philosophical concept. It wasn't a physical thing, so it couldn't bend. Philosophers made the argument that, no, you can't have that. It's a category error between terms. But then we discovered, oh, wait, yes, you can do that. which caused a massive upset in our modal intuitions about time and space. So it's possible that free will is like one of those things, but it seems less likely than it is actually a category error because we can't actually make it work. Like in the same sense as trying to square root a pork chop, no conceivable possibility of how to articulate that actually gets a result. In the same way that no conceivable possibility of describing free will gets us anything other than just determined or random or some combination of the two. So I seem to be able to equate the same thing as like a square root of a pork chop and free will, because they both seem equally impossible to articulate as anything other than just either one of these categories, math, or a physical thing like a pork chop, and they don't seem to overlap in any way.
Mm-hmm.
Just like determinism and random are the only two options. There doesn't seem to be anything we can add to that to get a new thing.
Hmm. Yeah, I actually think that argument begs the question, because you begin with the idea that it's either determined or random, and we have to put those two ideas together to get a new get free. Whereas
Oh
I
no,
think
I apologize. If, so my view is that you can describe it in any way you want, go for it. I just think that anything you do describe it as is going to end up being either determined or random. Not that it necessarily starts as those two.
oh yeah, I mean I would just say it's properly basic, metaphysically basic, a free choice, right? Which is okay. Hold on, I'm not sure I actually think this, but for the moment, I'm going to play with the idea that it's properly basic, and you might just say something like X had these reasons, and because of those reasons, freely chose to do Y. And then you say, oh, this free choice, was it random or determined? And then I would say, neither, it was free. And that is a basic ontological category of event, which is a free choice event. Um, and it can't be reduced to any combination of the other two. To simply begin with the presupposition that that category can't exist strikes me as begging the question.
All right, I would never do that. I grant that it's possible, just like I grant that time can bend is possibility. So I was granting it's definitely possible from the start.
Oh, and
So
then when it comes to the Einstein example, I totally agree. I think that really confirmed theories like general relativity can change even modal beliefs that we have. Okay, shout out to my fellow Kenyan colleagues here who were on the paper that discovered gravity waves last year that won the Nobel Prize. Okay, go Wades. Um, I think the evidence for general relativity is overwhelming.
oh,
Right?
just to jump right in, the point of the general relativity example was to say that free will is possible. So it is possible that our conceptions could be modally wrong, and there is free will. So that was the point I was making.
I understood you. I'm sorry. Yeah, and so to that extent, I want to say, yeah, we can rethink, but then I wouldn't do drastic rethinking simply on the basis of a metaphysical argument, right? Because I think, unlike science, metaphysics is usually wrong. Right?
So your description of free will, would that be a brute fact or like a metaphysical necessity based off your idea that it's properly basic?
If I don't have a conception of libertarian free will, I'm just going to leave that as a black box in my conception of minimal theism. There needs to be some kind of libertarian free choice in order to get a contingent possible world. And then at that point, I have no conception of what that is. I even find it difficult to conceive of how that would work. But I'm just going to add that. And let's say it takes minimal theism, has a low probability, add an atemporal, probably, libertarian free choice. That lowers the probability dramatically, but it's still so much higher than zero that if those are our only two options, we don't have an alternative, right? This is it. And so we have to have, unless we're going to radically rethink our understanding of the world, we don't have a choice but to accept that there probably is some kind of godlike thing that chose to create the actual world. That's why I like the quote from Sherlock Holmes, right? That once all the impossible answers have been excluded, whatever is left, no matter how improbable, must be the truth. I think that's just great. And so that's what I want to say. I say we're stuck unless we're willing to radically rethink our worldview on the basis of speculative metaphysical arguments, which I'm really doubtful about. Then we're trapped, unless I've made an error in my argument, which is, of course, very likely.
And you're arguing that free will isn't a metaphysical argument in that sense because it's properly basic and we have an experience of it? Because I would put the free will as in the same category as one of those metaphysical arguments.
all I need is I have no argument. All I need is I'm making the assumption that there's a coherent conception of free will, which I need because I need a logically coherent conception of minimal theism. If it's not logically coherent, then of course it's impossible, and so it doesn't help. So in order to probabilize these two hypotheses, all I need is a coherent conception of libertarian free will having God like thing. He has to have other properties, but he doesn't have to be the God of Western theism or chance. And they both are logically coherent. Otherwise, we
Okay,
can.
let me pick up on that real quick. So there's two responses I would have. One is if you're essentially like an atheist materialist and you reject free will, then that seems to be, is that the only basis you could conclude a God on? Because if there's no free will, then it seems like there isn't any reason, especially just going off of the physics, to believe in the God as opposed to the multiverse. Would that be fair to say?
No. Um, well, I think that the atheist would make an error in their reasoning here, right? Um, let's say, for example, I'm a hardcore naturalist, right? Is it how strong should I take my naturalism, right? Is it possible for me to be talked out of my naturalism, right? Is it a presupposition on my theories, on my metaphysical speculation? Remember, we had the conservative methodology where we have certain fixed ideas that are going to constrain our metaphysical speculation. Maybe the naturalist wants to say, oh, naturalism is one of those, right? At that point, I think the answer is no, because I think it's really for us an empirical question whether a godlike thing exists. To say that one knows a priori that there is no such thing, or it strikes me as very difficult given what we're saying is there does not exist anywhere a thing of this description.
Oh, right,
Well,
right. I agree. I wouldn't want to. I wouldn't want to make that argument, but I would.
oh, okay.
I want to take the approach that I did, where free will is just an incoherent idea, as far as we can tell.
Libertarian.
Yes, libertarian free will. So I would say that you can't appeal to that to try and indicate a God. So with that off the table, is there anything else that can indicate a God as opposed to the multiverse? Because just going off of physics, I think there isn't.
Um, I mean, what I would say then is you're now balancing your probabilities are there is a coherent conception of libertarian free will that you just don't know about or we haven't thought of yet, versus the probability that the universe came to be by chance or the actual world came to be by chance. And if those are my two options, since our chance hypothesis is approximately zero and the other one isn't, then we go with that one.
Okay, just to rephrase. So just assume libertarian free will is logically incoherent or uh, something like that. But would there be anything else that could indicate a God without that? Or was that just the only thing that really indicates a God? So if we disprove free will in that sense, then God's gone, right?
If you had a proof for the incoherence of every possible conception of libertarian free will that could play the role that I need it to play, and you had a proof that all of these, because there's many conceptions of libertarian free will, that all of them are incoherent, and you have a very persuasive paper, and I've read it and I'm persuaded. Now, what happens in my probabilities? Now, again, I'm reasoning. Oh, if we can take the theism off the table, then I have to believe that the actual world came to be by random chance, and that there's an alpha similar world by chance, unless I'm going to be a necessitarian and a Spinozist. But the probability of that occurring by chance is so low that it seems as though the probability that your paper is wrong is higher. And so I think one should infer, if all of my background reasoning is correct, one should infer that there is a coherent conception of libertarian free will because it is actual.
Well, I'm trying to ask, like, is there anything else other than free will that could indicate a God? Like, from my perspective, since I don't grant free will, then, and so from my perspective, free will doesn't indicate a God in any sense, like
Right.
exactly zero,
But if my
essentially.
reasoning is correct, I think you should rethink that view.
But that's not the point of the question. So the point of the
Oh,
question is just, is there anything else that could get you to the free will? Because if you're more like a naturalist like me, you don't grant free will. So what else could you use to try and indicate a God? Because is there, from the question I like to ask, because I had Luke Barnes, Robin Collins, and Hugh Ross on my show earlier, and I
oh,
asked one of the things I asked them is anything, if we're just looking at physics, there's no combination of principles, particles, and laws that can get you a God. So nothing in physics indicates a God. It's only once you add the philosophical argument that you get a God, as far as I can tell. So if we don't talk about the moral argument and the free will thing, is there anything else that can get you there?
Let me give you two answers again. First, it's only when you add the extra metaphysical stuff that you get naturalism.
Right.
The idea that this chair exists, and then the claim that only this chair exists, or material objects exist, to the claim only material objects exist, is a huge philosophical leap. So any of these worldviews, like you don't get naturalism out of science either.
All right. It doesn't say that there's only natural things. It's only natural stuff that we currently know about,
Yeah,
essentially.
and then you'd say, well, there might be supernatural things. I mean, the science is totally silent on this question, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Whether there's anything additional, I mean, I would say the fact that the actual world is alpha similar is strong evidence because the probability of that occurring by chance is so low, and there's no other explanation on the board except minimal theism. And so we should infer, since the actual world is the kind of world it is, that there probably is some kind of God. Let me try to make it more intuitive. Maybe there's like a religious sense that people sometimes have when they're like walking around and they're like, wow, why are things like this? Right. I was just having a conversation about sexual reproduction in children, right? Like, if you hadn't seen it, like, or like, you would never believe that this exists. And it's really bizarre and really strange. And you're like, why is it this way rather than some other way? Right. Like, this is so weird. That intuition, what that intuition is there's so many possible worlds. Why does a world like this one exist? Right? Um, that's what the intuition is, sort of translated into philosophical language. What you're amazed by is the vastness of the set of possible worlds, and the fact that worlds like this one is an infinitesimally small subset of those worlds. That's the intuition I'm pulling on, or I mean, maybe that's the intuition that might be psychologically persuasive to somebody, because I want to say the probability that occurred by chance is so low that we need another explanation, unless you're going to be a necessitarian or something, holding our background assumptions constant. Theism is the only, some sort of generic theism is the only option on the board. And so we need to adopt, I mean, that view is more reasonable than any other view.
Well, let me take that part, for example. So if I want to claim there is this new property, so particles can either do things randomly or determined, but I'm going to say there's this new property, which is a black box, which we don't have an argument for, which is called the free particleness. And it can essentially do everything free will does, but without any consciousness. We just don't know how. And we can say this new property explains the universe in the way it is. I mean, you're not going to be compelled by this, right? Until I actually give some articulate definition of what that means. It's just like, what? Right? I mean, you would not find that compelling, right?
Yeah, no, I like that. Let me play with that idea for a while. I like that. So let's say there's a necessary natural thing that is not conscious, but has something that can fill the same theoretical role as libertarian free will. Now, what is that thing? Well, I can't tell you much about it, right? I mean, it's very difficult, right? But look at the alternative. The alternative is random chance, right? And so, what's the prior probability that necessary natural thing with this libertarian like, but not free will, like free will thing exists is low, but of course, the probability is zero on the other side. And so, we have to admit. What do I think of that? I think that's really interesting. What do I want to say about that? I mean, like, my initial intuition is I'm not even sure you're making a proposition, but then couldn't you just say the same thing? You're not saying
Exactly.
make a proposition when you make a free will. Like, you're not actually saying anything, right?
Exactly. That's the reason I bring up this argument, is because from the atheist perspective, that's exactly what you're doing. And so I'm
Mm-hmm.
trying to create a mirror that articulates the atheist position as clearly as possible.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, so you're imagining a non-conscious free choice. And then I want to say, oh, that doesn't make any sense, right? But then you say, well, yeah, I don't think libertarian free will makes any sense, right?
Exactly.
Um, yeah, that's interesting. That's fun. I don't quite know what I think about that. Um, except to sort of go back to a point I make earlier in the book, right? Which is something like this. There's like an infinite number of ad hoc hypotheses that we could consider. And so you run into a really weird problem if you take into account all the hypotheses, which is some ad hoc hypothesis or other becomes the best explanation for everything, right? Like, why is there a table in this room? Well, I mean, one explanation is it was put here by the maintenance people, right? Another explanation would be tiny gnomes flew out of the sky and put it here, okay? And then let's make an, each of these have, oh my gosh, right? Some ad hoc hypothesis. It explains why there's a desk in this room. Um, and you think, oh, that's wrong, right? The reasoning here is mistaken. Where have we gone wrong? And I think what we've gone wrong is I think we should only take into account hypotheses that we have other reasons to think are true, right? I think we need to constrain the set of hypotheses that we're sort of considering.
And in the context of free will, the other reasons would be like the properly basic belief and the fact that we intuitively believe we have free will. Those would be the other reasons in that context.
As I was using properly basic, I was taking it as a metaphysical category, not as an epistemic one. But
Well, so what would be the difference between free will? What is our reasons to believe in free will as opposed to the free particleness?
well, I think we do have other reasons to believe that a godlike thing exists. Now, those other reasons are not very persuasive, right? There's lots of people who say they've had experiences of this thing. There's various people who claim that they are prophets from this thing, et cetera, et cetera. And I think all of those give us reasons to raise the prior probability of this belief, right? There's a reason we're talking about it. We're not talking about the flying spaghetti monster or whatever. Because it has some non-trivial prior probability of being true, given all of our background information, right? That's true, right?
Well, sort of, because I wouldn't necessarily consider people's experience of it as raising the prior probability. I don't think
At
that
all?
at all. So I would say that people's experience of something has no correlation to the way it actually is. I would say,
Not true. There's at least generally a if I told you I saw Bigfoot, that's some evidence in favor of the existence of Bigfoot, no?
in case of Bigfoot, I would agree because Bigfoot is a combination of principles, particles, and laws in physics. But if you said you had experienced something outside of physics, like if you said you experienced a square circle, I'd be like, that doesn't raise the prior probability at all.
Yeah. No,
But
I agree.
it's just not in the case of just logically incoherent things. I would also say if you experience something that is completely new, like a new essence or existence or something non-physics, essentially, I would say that in the same way it is not evidence for a square circle, it's not evidence for those things because I don't think our experiences are a reliable guide to understand those kinds of things. I don't think our experiences are barely reliable to understand the physics kinds of stuff. So I would personally not consider that as raising the prior probability of God, simply because people believe that or believed it in the past. I think that's purely accidental.
I mean, I do think that's weak evidence. But let me take the experiential question again. If I told you that I had had direct experience of God, I have not. Okay, but suppose I had. Um, would that count as any evidence at all? Even really weak evidence?
It would count, like I told you about my epistemology earlier, that would count as conceptual evidence. So I would grant that you have an idea of God in your head,
Mhm.
but I wouldn't go any further than that. It would not account for any kind of empirical.
A godlike thing exists has no support based on that evidence.
None at all. No more than just the fact that we can imagine it. So it would be
What
like of the alpha possible worlds, like you mentioned for possible worlds. It's
if,
essentially just something someone imagined as a possible thing, and that's it.
what if you experienced it?
I would still go on that same route until it made testable predictions. So if I could say I believe a God exists, and if God exists, I can predict this will occur, and then it's testably and verifiable, then I'm like, yep, that's evidence of a God. That would work. So if I can say I believe God exists, and this guy's going to raise from the dead in 3 days, and he raises from the dead in 3 days, that's good evidence. I grant that.
That's
But I
good evidence.
wouldn't. But my personal experience would not be sufficient.
See, I worry about that as an epistemology, right? I had a great discussion with Larry Shapiro at Wisconsin. He wrote the book Miracle Myth. Super smart guy, really interesting, very funny guy. And basically, the whole purpose of the book is to show that belief in the resurrection of Jesus is unreasonable given our current evidence, right? But but he gets there by saying the amount of evidence one would need to make it rational is so high that even if all of us saw it today and it was on CNN and we were like touching him and talking to him and he was giving interviews, that wouldn't count as sufficient evidence either. Oh, Larry, okay. If that doesn't count as sufficient evidence, then I mean, you've put
What
your
does?
yeah, then it's in principle impossible. So I said, give me what would count as sufficient evidence for a miracle. And he writes back and he's like, well, I don't want to rule it out a priori, but nothing comes to mind.
Right, I totally agree with you on this. I think that is a ridiculous standard. I would not. I know that standard is just essentially skepticism, like radical skepticism.
No, I would actually say, I love you, Larry, but I would say it's dogmatism, right? You're just saying,
Yes,
I believe this. I don't want to believe the alternative. So the amount of evidence I would need to persuade me of the alternative is absolute metaphysical certainty.
right. And
Cartesian,
I would not say that. So let me answer the same question.
right? But that's where I'm afraid you're going.
Well, let me answer the question. Let me answer, because you would ask, what would convince you of a miracle? From my
Yeah.
perspective, if you believe miracles exist, you say, well, miracles occur in these conditions, and we can verify that because here are these conditions, and we expect this result. And if it happens, then I will grant that's evidence of miracles. So, like, if Jesus raised from the dead and you predict he's going to come back, however many, like for the second coming or whatever, and we can go and ask him questions, and he answers the questions in a specific way, I grant that as evidence. Like, or if you predict that the God exists, you pray to the God, person's arm grows back on TV or whatever, that's evidence. I count it. So any just novel, testable predictions, I count as evidence.
What would count as evidence for like rare miracles?
I don't think anything would, because I think the first standard for evidence is how do we tell the difference between the asserted event and an imaginary thing. I think that's what evidence fundamentally is that evidence is anything that can tell the difference between this being imaginary and this being real. And if it can't do that, it's not evidence. So if there's a rare miracle, that would be like saying an alien abducted me last night. Like, I don't think there's going to be any evidence for that just off of essentially your testimony. I think you would need actual kind of like, if an alien abducted you, well, then maybe there's a hole in your roof. And if we find a hole in your roof, okay, that may be evidence. But I wouldn't just count the testimony in that case. You would need some kind of testable prediction.
Experienced the alien abduction, even
Yeah,
if it say unique in its experience, you had nothing like it before, and then would that be sufficient for you
no,
to really?
right, because I would say that that does not give us a way to differentiate, is that imaginary or is that real? The experience, go ahead.
Go ahead.
Oh yeah, so if again, my criterion for evidence is, can you differentiate between the imaginary and the real? And experiencing something unique and new, people do that all the time when they take LSD or ecstasy or have delusions or epileptic seizures. Those happen all the time. So simply taking the testimony on its own would not be a way to differentiate, is this imaginary experience or is this a real experience? So my criterion of evidence is you got to have something that can do that, and just the experience doesn't seem to be able to do that.
That's interesting, but I have certain worries. Like, I think you've ruled out a priori the rationality of belief in unique events.
Essentially, yeah. So I think that if there's a unique event, it's not reasonable to believe it just based off it being a unique event, because it could just be a delusion. Unless there's leads like there could be consequences, like the Big Bang Theory. The Big Bang Theory has consequences like the universe expanding at a certain rate, the cosmic microwave background, and so we can say if we assume the Big Bang happened, then we can predict these consequences of it. And that would be good evidence. So in that case, if there's a unique event that has consequences and those consequences make testable predictions, that's good evidence of the unique event. But if it's just like a purely unique event that has no causal influence on anything other than somebody's imagination, then no, I would say that doesn't work.
Even in your own case.
Especially in my own case.
Especially in your own case. That's interesting, right? Because I sort of worry that, because I do think it's possible. Like, I do think that if I had a direct experience of divine reality or whatever, that would give me evidence sufficient to make it rational for me to believe that exists. Now, not initially, right? I might need to go through, like, I don't know, I'm walking down Middle Path here at Kenyon, and the clouds part and the light shines on me, and it's like, Jason, why have you forsaken me? And I, whatever. Would that be evidence sufficient for belief? And I think the answer is yes, assuming that I have no good reason to think that I'm insane. I have no good reason to think that I'm, have been, someone's given me LSD. Now, again, is it absolutely certain? No, experiential evidence never gives absolute certainty.
All right, I totally agree with that, but isn't the fact that you have a human brain made of neurons a sufficient reason to believe that you're fallible in that sense? Isn't that essentially equivalent to saying you're delusional because it's a brain? We have brains, we know how brains work, we know that they have flaws. Therefore, because I have a brain, it's not reasonable to believe I have access to fundamental truths like if I saw God. We have a good reason to believe we're probably delusional, which is we have brains, unfortunately, and they don't work very well.
No, first I would say that I'm fallible, absolutely. But fallible and wrong are two totally different things, right? I had this divine experience. It was unlike other experiences, blah, blah, blah. Let's take a real example, like near-death experiences, right? These turn out to be relatively common, right? Like millions of them, right?
17%, I think, is something like 17% of people or something like that.
That is staggering, right? Okay, now let's say I've had one of these experiences, which I haven't, which is probably good. And would that be evidence sufficient for me to believe that consciousness apart from the body or whatever is possible or actual, right? I think the answer is yes, right? It would be.
Now, I would not agree.
Evidence? No, it's not infallible evidence. It's possible that I'm wrong, right? The question is just, does the direct experience of the thing give me evidence sufficient for belief? Now, the case here is very tricky because my brain is undergoing an odd situation. If there was other plausible explanations on the table, I'd need to look at them. But I think it's at least theoretically possible that the experience would be so compelling that one would say, "Oh, like I saw it, like I've seen it, and I don't care what everyone says. Like I watched it happen or whatever." And that evidence is just more persuasive to me. And I actually would think that could be quite reasonable, even for a committed atheist or a committed naturalist.
I would not agree with that, especially in the case of near-death experiences. I've had a few conversations about those before. So my interpretation specifically of near-death experiences is that I would go with I have a flawed brain and something happened which I couldn't explain. And I think that's a pretty reasonable conclusion, especially because given essentially the interpretation of near-death experiences is the fact that when your brain shuts off unexpectedly, most of the connections in your brain are still going on as if normal. So all of the things that you experience around you, which your senses are still absorbing as electrical signals, essentially just get saved to conscious memory without you being conscious. And so when you wake up, you have this experience of hearing people talk about things that are going on in the room, and you remember that as being a conscious experience. So you think, oh, I was conscious when that happened. And so you recall it as being a near-death experience of you like lifting out of your body and hearing the drills or feeling the touches or hearing someone talk about these things. But really that was all just stuff that happened and was saved to your conscious memory and was recalled later. And so the fact that the brain is a biological system that we know works in that kind of a way is pretty good reason to not accept that as I actually left my body. Mm-hmm. In order for it to be good evidence that you actually left your body, I would still want novel testable predictions.
Yeah, I mean, I grant you that there may be other alternative explanations on the board. There's rarely is evidence such that it only yields one explanation, right? There's going to be a collection of theoretical possibilities.
Right, like never, like the problem of underdetermination.
Yeah, you're always going to have this problem. So then the question becomes like, okay, well, which theory is supported? And largely that's going to turn on priors, I think. Like, which of these theories has the highest prior? But is my naturalism, say, so deep that no experience could persuade me otherwise? And I think the answer to that would have to be no. I mean, naturalism at best is a very, very weak view. I only need one non-natural thing to disprove it. Also, my experience of the universe is trivially tiny. I've seen part of one planet in the middle of flicking nowhere, let alone if there are other universes, right? So like my experience of reality is tiny, and so I want to say the only things that exist are the things that are like around me. Um, I mean, maybe, but I mean, I don't need a lot of evidence to disprove that view. So that's a very fragile position, I would
Oh,
say.
right. I agree. Like most naturalists are like methodological naturalists. We only agree that the natural is all we can show, but we wouldn't say that it's all that there is. Like I'm not a metaphysical naturalist. I would say there can absolutely be a supernatural. There can absolutely be magic. I grant that. But my criterion for epistemology is for something to be reasonable to believe, as opposed to just being a possibility, you have to have the first criterion is you have to have someone to differentiate, is this real or is this imaginary? And I
Mm-hmm.
wouldn't consider experience to be a successful means to do that.
I think it would be a successful, but not an infallible means for doing that.
Well, how
Right.
so? Like just on the successful part. I mean, I grant it's nothing is infallible essentially, other than I think therefore I am. That's the only thing we've got. But
And Hume has something to say about that, but go ahead.
so how why would you consider that to be successful as it because I mean we know so much about the human brain and delusions and illusions and misconceptions and epilepsy and things that happen in the brain all the time. Why would you think that that would be successful?
I mean, if I go outside and I see a tree, um, is my experience of the tree evidence sufficient to believe that there really is a tree there, right?
Well, let me answer that part. I would say partially yes, partially no. I would say that the reason it's reasonable to believe you see a tree is not just because of your experience of the tree, but the addition of the fact that we have implicit empirical evidence of trees. Like we have lots of scientific evidence of trees. We know what trees work. We know how to plant them. So there's lots of testable predictions that trees have been made across the past history. So the addition of that implicit empirical evidence in addition to your experience does make it reasonable to believe you saw a tree. But if you don't have both of those, then
Mhm.
it would
But
not be.
about a tree, I'm talking about this particular tree, Bob. Science tells me nothing about Bob. But why do I believe Bob the tree exists?
Well,
Uh,
I think the class is sufficient. So if I think that you don't need specific evidence of Bob, like if I told you I saw a dog, that would be reasonable, not because you have any evidence of the dog, but because we have evidence of dogs as a class. So the
mhm.
fact that dogs make testable predictions, that evidence, in addition to my testimony, makes it reasonable to believe I saw a dog, even if you don't
Mhm.
have evidence of that particular dog.
Right, but your claim is stronger. Your claim is that you saw that particular dog, right? Not just some dog or other, right? You saw that particular dog, right? And you're justified in believing that. And I grant that there's a set of background assumptions that raise the probabilities and change it and stuff like that. And then I go outside and I don't know, I see aliens coming down, right? And walking around or something like this. Now, at first, right, I think it's reasonable to check, right? Like, do I have reason to believe that I'm insane? Because one possibility, of course, is that I'm insane and don't know it. There are lots of people who are insane and don't know it. Okay. I could be one of those people. Um, so now I sort of have to judge the probability that I'm crazy and don't know it versus the probability that there actually are aliens who occasionally visit the planet. Um, and the priors, I think, are going to determine that, right? But I think if I have no particular good reason to believe I'm crazy, if I've gone through psychological tests and done chemical tests or something, and I have no reason to believe I'm insane, even if the experience is one off, I might say, well, the probability that there are aliens who visit the planet very occasionally is low, but my unknown insanity is lower. So I'm going to say there probably were aliens. Now, again, it's not infallible, but there probably were. Same exact reasoning would work for a religious experience case, I think.
Well, just using that one example, let's say, because for me, the prior probability is that your brain had a misfire and that's what it caused it, is going to be more likely than aliens existing. So the fact that we know brains are biological systems that misfire regularly all over the world all the time seems to have a much higher prior than that aliens exist. So I don't think that one experience would justify belief aliens because the prior that you have a biological system that misfired is going to have a much higher prior than aliens actually exist unless you can additionally show that testable predictions thing. Because if you have that, then the priors go just off the roof that it's, or the posterior evidence of aliens justifies belief in aliens at that point.
Because of the predictions.
Hmm.
Right.
But yeah, I would
Yeah,
say that the priors are more likely on the delusion side because we know we have brains.
right. And this would be true no matter how persuasive the experience, no matter how long it went on. If
Oh,
it
I
went
would
on,
say the more persuasive it is, the less likely it was probably true, actually. So I think that the like one of the cases that we know about are epileptics who have experiences of things like God, and they are just the most unbelievably meaningful experiences that anyone could experience. And I'm relatively reasonably sure that that's true. Like because of how their brains are firing and the elevated electrical activity, their experience and sensation in that thing that they experienced are probably much greater than anything I've ever experienced. It was probably more real for them than anything I have ever experienced in my life. But
Hmm.
I don't think that the level of their feeling it being real is in any way evidence that it wasn't imaginary. Because again, I think that in order to demonstrate something, make it a reasonable belief that this exists outside of your head, you need first to give some basis of evidence to differentiate, is this imaginary or is this real? And because the prior probability of our brains misfiring is so high, because we know it happens so often in so many cases all over the world for every human being, that's going to rule out any kind of unique instance of something happening.
Yeah, I mean, I worry a little bit about like take a case. I look at a tree. The tree light bounces off it. It hits my eyes. Right, electrical impulses go to my brain. There's some sort of process nobody understands, and I have a conscious experience of a tree. Right now, if you were to look at me and say, "Oh, the tree probably isn't there because your brain was actually causing the experience of the tree," right? Well, yeah, but my idea would be it was because the tree was interacting in some way with my brain that produced the conscious experience. So I have an experience of God, and you say, "Oh, well, your brain was doing such and so." Well, sure. That's neither evidence for nor against, I would say, the idea that it was caused by some sort of external agent, right? And that it's through the interaction with the brain or whatever that the conscious experience came to be. I mean, we really don't even have the slightest clue how any of this works. So, I mean, oh, well, when people are going through these experiences, their brain is undergoing a certain change. I mean, they could say something like, well, yeah, the reason for that is because God's bumping into them in the way that light does or something. And I see no way to rule that out, right? Now you want to say, well, there's naturalistic alternatives that could be explanatory in these contexts. And naturalistic explanations are to be preferred over supernatural ones because they're simpler, right?
Oh, I wouldn't go that far. So, because I wouldn't say they're simpler. I'd actually say many naturalistic explanations are not at all simple. Like what
Well, they're
causes
simple.
lightning?
I don't need supernatural entities, which is good theoretically.
Right. So my argument would be is that in the case of the tree, we have background knowledge of empirical testable predictions of trees existing. So we have good reason to believe that trees as a category are not imaginary. And so that additional thing of the class of trees not being an imaginary thing, saying you saw a tree, is reasonable. Like if I told you I saw a dog, it's reasonable to believe I saw a dog because we have lots of evidence of dogs. If I told you I saw a unicorn, that would not be reasonable. And the reason that's not reasonable is because the unicorns don't have that additional evidence of the empirical basis that can show that unicorns as a class are not imaginary. Right now, we only have reason to believe that unicorns as a class are just imaginary things. And until we can move that up and show that unicorns are not a class of imaginary, like if we found fossils of unicorns or something, then it may be reasonable to believe that, oh, maybe you did see a unicorn. Maybe it was real because now we have evidence outside that can differentiate between the imaginary and the real that elevates that unicorns things independent of our experience. And until we have both of those things, I don't think the experience raises the prior probability above that. It was probably just something in your brain.
Yeah, I mean, this is interesting. I think this view is interesting because I think what you want to say then is you need these additional kinds of evidence to raise the prior probability above zero or close to zero.
Well, no, I wouldn't say zero. So I'd say it needs to raise the prior probability above whatever the number is of it's a brain delusion, of a
Yeah.
brain fart or something. And I
Yeah.
wouldn't say that's zero. It's not, definitely not zero. I would say that's actually a pretty high number.
Okay. Yeah, that's good. See, that strikes me as a coherent view. That's really interesting, right? So you want to say, oh, any experience has a certain probability X of being an illusion.
Yes.
So you need evidence sufficient to raise the probability above that number, whatever it is, that it's not,
Yes.
right? And then your additional claim, which is your key claim here, is that the only kinds of evidence that can do that
No, no. So
are
the only kind I know about is testable predictions. There could be lots of other ways to do it.
good. Um, yeah, that's interesting. So then you want to say the only ways I know to raise a prior above that number is through classic scientific means of reproducing and things like this. And then you say, oh, it has the unfortunate consequence of ruling out a priori any unique experience, even if it's real. So even if God comes to you and is literally talking to you, you're like, sorry, man, it's irrational for me to believe that you're talking to me, right? Even if it's real, it's not rational to believe in it. Um, yeah, I mean, and that's a negative. I mean, that's a negative. That's a problem for the epistemology here, I think.
Well, why would that be a problem? Because I think
But
that's a reasonable leap to make. Like I could say you could still choose to believe. Like if you want to choose to believe that's God, I'm totally okay with that.
whoa,
But I
whoa,
don't
whoa.
think it's rational.
Yeah, it would be an irrational belief. That's not good.
I don't think so. I think that because of how the brain works, I think we don't have a way to establish things that are true in that sense. I don't think that even if we experience something as real and like experience God right away, because of how fallible our brains are, I don't think we can potentially justify a belief in that yet. We don't have a way yet to be able to do that.
I mean, yeah, that's really interesting. My initial thoughts, I mean, I have two particular thoughts about this epistemological approach, which I genuinely like. The first is that I may think that there are additional types of evidence that can raise the prior. Um, and then my second worry is sort of a general worry, which is you're going to have certain universal beliefs um, that aren't justifiable, right? Can you show, for example, that you're not the only thing that exists, right? Or can you show, for example, even worse, that your epistemological criteria are good, right? Um, so you're going to need different kinds of evidence there. Um, but I do kind of worry a little bit about that. Like, I mean, you're always going to have the skeptical worries of like, can I prove that my memory is accurate? No. To do so, I'd have to use my memory, and so we're in a circle, and things are terrible. So you're just going to have to stipulate, right? That it. I mean, there's no rational way to do it in that sense. If there
Actually,
is, tell me somebody.
yes, there is.
Oh, there
Because
is.
that isn't a claim independent of the world. So if I claim that essentially one like A equals A or something, that's not an empirically demonstrable thing. Well, that's not a claim about the world. That's a claim about a system of logic in my head. So I can make analytical claims and justify those as being knowledge without making claims about the world
Yeah,
necessarily. And
sure.
so the question, this epistemology I'm using only applies to claims about the world. So we can have, if it's just an analytical claim, those can be justified without claims about the world. And so in the case of, now I grant that we could be wrong about the epistemology, but I like to use the same starting point you do. Let's grant scientific realism in some sense. Let's grant that the scientific method works.
Right.
And so just granting those things, which they may be false, but who knows, we can use those as a basis to say, yeah, this is how we differentiate. Now, I agree totally with your first point that there may be other ways to raise the prior probability other than the scientific method. Tell me what those are, and I'm totally with you on that, whatever those are.
Yeah, I mean, my temptation is to say something like vivid experience absent a defeater. Um, Now, again, it's not infallible, but I would say it's persuasive.
Well, I
Uh,
mean, isn't the fact that epileptics have vivid experience and they don't know of a defeater, but we do know of a defeater, doesn't that
know
prove that
of
isn't
it, know of it, right? Or they should know of it. If it's a defeater, again, I'm not sure it's a defeater. The fact that the brain is doing something strange, because I mean, the brain does something strange every time I look at a tree. But if you have a defeater, what you're saying is, oh, these people have beliefs based on experience, but I know those beliefs are false, or at least I have reason to believe that their justification is undercut by this new piece of information. Yeah, I would have to say those cases are ruled out. That they're,
but again, you wouldn't say that about the fact that we know brains how brains work. You wouldn't count that as a defeater.
I mean, I know that my eyes sometimes misperceive things, right? So I see something strange, right? Now, could my eyes be misperceiving it? Sure. So I need to sort of rule that out. How do I do that? I look at it very carefully. I look at it for a long time. I don't know. I ask other people to look at it or whatever. Actually, let's leave other people out of it to keep with the experiential evidence, right? Maybe I can see it or touch it or hear it or something, and then I think, okay, that's reason to believe that I'm not undergoing one of those illusions. Um, Now, I could be wrong. There could be a different kind of illusion I'm not aware of. Um, but I would say that's evidence sufficient for belief, absent a defeater. Like later, I discover I was injected with LSD. That's a defeater, right? Um, it undercuts my evidence. But I would say before that, I think I have sufficient evidence. Because I think the claim that it's irrational to believe in the existence of God, even if God literally spoke to you, is a really counterintuitive claim. I find that so you're saying, God, there's literally nothing you could do to persuade me that you exist, even if he really does.
Oh no, no, no! They're testable predictions. Like if I say I believe in God, I pray to God, gold brick appears in front of me. Pray to God, gold brick appears in front of me. That works. That's evidence.
I worry, but wouldn't that be subject to brain fallibility as well?
Well, that's where the testable predictions come in because we're granting that the scientific method does work as a way to differentiate between imagination and reality. And so if we grant that, and God can make testable predictions using the scientific method, like the gold brick thing, and everyone else sees the gold bricks, and we can use the gold bricks to like weigh things or trade them in for cars or whatever, that would count as evidence. So if we're granting the scientific method does differentiate and God can scientifically do this, that's evidence.
That's interesting. But then, okay. And then the general skeptical point that you may be insane and all of this has been invented, you want to rule out.
Well, I'm just ruling that out essentially by asserting it, just saying if we grant the scientific method works, then we've ruled that out.
So you're okay with short term, relatively short term delusions, but sort of long term systematic delusions that you're undergoing, long term systematic delusions, you want to rule out on methodological grounds. So if God talks to me right now and I say, God, please create a red, a brick or whatever, and then he does it, and then he does it again, and he's like, but no more, right? And then leaves. Oh, man. Like, is that sufficient evidence? How long do the testable predictions have to work?
That's a great question. So I would just say whatever science deems sufficient. I don't know exactly what that is.
Not a good answer.
Well, I'm just saying we're granting that science works, and so whatever science deems that is going to be the standard.
I don't know. Yeah. I mean, what would be rational? Yeah, I guess you could just say this is a borderline case. I don't know what to say. So, but
well, actually, your example is a really good example that is actually in cosmology right now, because eventually we know that the universes are going to fly away so far that we never see them. So is it rational at that point, when the people living at that time don't see the universes, is it reasonable to, or the galaxies, is it reasonable to believe that there are other galaxies out there? Because we can't actually do any testable predictions with them, but we know they made testable predictions in the past. So that's an unsolved problem in science. I don't know what the answer is.
And I know you've addressed this, but I do think you are going to have problems in terms of general cosmology. Like, oh, if our theory is true, then various microwaves will be found in the background or whatever. But hold on, we only have one instance, right, of this, and so whether our Big Bang was ordinary or unusual is something that we can't answer. And so there are philosophy of cosmology where people worry like this isn't even science because it's not testable and stuff like this. I think that's not plausible.
What's not plausible?
I think the claim that we can't trust the cosmology because the universe is unique is wrong. I think that's a mistake. But it is a view that lots of people hold. I'm told anyway.
Well, my interpretation on that is that since I think that physicists, what they do is they just make combinations of principles, particles, laws, and physics, and they combine them in new ways. Even if those combinations are unverifiable, it's still more plausible than adding anything new to the theory, regardless of what the combinations are. So like using the example of the original thing we started with of the UFO creating the crop circles, or just more of the jokesters, as long as we're just combining things we already know exist, I think that's more reasonable than asserting a new kind of a thing. So like the two different kinds of simplicity you mentioned, the
qualitative and quantitative.
Yes.
I'm actually with you. I mean, ceteris paribus. I don't want to. I think adding a new object, especially a weird object, to your ontology is a terrible idea unless you're forced to do it. The problem I have in the book is if my argument up till that point is correct, there is no alternative except to accept a minimal theism, um, because there's no other alternative in the logical space of possible explanations. And so I'm forced into accepting that there probably is a truly bizarre entity because the only alternative has a near zero probability.
Well, let's take the multiverse theory, for example. The multiverse is just early universe inflation vacuum states. That's all it is. It's just
There's a
those.
lot of different multiverse theories. That's one version.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Well, yeah, absolutely, absolutely. But so that one version is just combinations of known physics. We have verified early universe inflation, or at least that's also a combination of things. Goose inflation, and we verified vacuum states for sure. We can empirically verify vacuum states. We've done the tests about the two metal things that were far apart and they put together. But those are things in physics. Those are all combinations of things in physics. So it seems, from my perspective, that's more reasonable than asserting a new kind of a supernatural thing.
Oh, I don't have a. I mean, first of all, I mean, in order to get to a multiverse theory, I have to take known physics and add totally unverifiable metaphysical presuppositions that are doing a lot of the work.
What do you mean?
That there are universes outside of this one.
Well, that's a consequence of the vacuum states in the early universe inflation. That's not an assumption.
Um, okay, that's interesting. I'd have to look into that.
This is Sean Carroll's model, in case you're
very well
curious.
be right about this. Yeah.
So that's just Sean Carroll's model, just so you know where to find it.
Okay. Yeah, that's interesting. All right, I might be wrong about that. Um, what was I going to say? I was going to say something.
You mentioned that there were metaphysical assumptions you had to make.
Oh yeah. But that's why the modal argument that I have, you can't make a multiverse argument because it leads to modal realism. My question is not why does this universe exist? My question is why does the actual world, this kind of actual world, so there is in principle no scientific explanation for that. I mean, there couldn't in principle be. So now we're all in the realm of metaphysics, and we're going to divide up our logical space. And I just want to say there isn't another option on the board. If you can give me another option, which is more plausible, then we'll go with that. But I mean, it's either chance or there's some kind of God. Chance is so low that however low our God idea is, as long as it's non-zero, it wins.
Right. Well, that's where my free particleness kind of counter argument comes in. But what did you think about the
a necessary particle with something like free will that does the free will role that you had earlier? I worry now about it being just ad hoc.
That's kind of the atheist interpretation of the theist's argument, is because those adding those properties like free will and intentionality or consciousness of some kind outside of a physical brain seems kind of ad hoc from the atheist perspective, even if you.
I don't think so. I mean, even as an atheist, it's not ad hoc. You need this being to have free will so it can make choices. I mean, that naturally means it probably needs some kind of consciousness so that it can reason and have decisions. So that, I mean, those would just follow from the theoretical role. It's not random, like it has to have purple feet or something.
Or to rephrase, it's like it seems like it's arbitrary that we came up to those beliefs first. Like we came to the belief that there is a God first, which makes it not ad hoc somehow, or we came to the belief that we have free will before we discovered essentially neurology. And because we came to that belief first, then that somehow makes it less ad hoc. Seems to be an arbitrary way to make a belief system.
Oh, I agree. I don't think the time sequence matters much. I just want to say there is weak evidence for the existence of God, even prior to fine tuning. That raises the prior probability.
You mean all the other arguments and stuff?
Well, I mean, I would say experience, lots of religious experience, stuff like this. Now, again, it's not perfect, it's not very strong, but I mean, it gives non-zero evidence, and so, I would say, yeah, going into the experience, we have a prior probability that godlike thing exists as non-zero. And then there's no alternative, right? Unless you want to say, oh, well, maybe there's a physical theory metaphysically necessary with a new kind of causation that we don't know anything about that replicates the role of free will in your theory, right? But has no conscious experience, right? Okay. Um, Now, my concern, that's interesting. I haven't thought about this, so I think that's genuinely interesting, and it'll be in the second edition of the book if I get to write one.
Oh, there's one more question I wanted to ask really quick. So your
My
main
one,
art.
my worry then is that this seems ad hoc, right? That we're just creating an alternative hypothesis simply because we don't want to accept the best hypothesis. But then, okay, let's look at the prior probability for the existence of this new kind of necessary being with free will, like something, necessary entity. And then I would say we have zero prior evidence or almost zero prior evidence for such a thing. Maybe a general disposition towards naturalism could count. But again, this thing is so fluffing weird that, like, I'm not sure that's better than theism.
It's not. Absolutely, it's not. So my the way I approach this is I think that the most reasonable position is only using combinations of things we have already verified. So if it's a combination of physics, that's more plausible than adding anything new. And
Well,
if a different
I,
hypothesis is going to add something new, well, then I can just add a new thing of a different kind of the same essential level of complexity or something. And so if you want to assert new property X, I can just assert new property not X or something to do the same thing. And until we verified one or the other, I think we should just dismiss both possibilities and say, okay, we're going to stick with the physics. And that's, from my perspective, the most reasonable interpretation.
yeah, I mean, I would say no. We are in fact doing metaphysics, and when we're doing metaphysics, we're constrained by metaphysical methodology, which is we're using our reasoning capacities. Our reasoning capacities are terrible. We have to be really careful about it. We have to argue with people who disagree with us because we have confirmation bias and lots of other biases. But it does provide justification for certain beliefs, um, as long as they're not contradicting beliefs we have better reason to believe in. Um, and I would just say because we have no other choice. If you're going to ask the question like, why is the universe alpha similar? Why is it fine tuned? Metaphysics is the only game in town. So we have to do metaphysics. We can do it well or we can do it badly. But I mean, there's no other choice. So you could just begin by saying, oh, I don't think metaphysical arguments can ever justify anything. Therefore, we should just stick to the physics and remain complete skeptics about everything else. Oh, I mean, okay. I mean, then you want to say, oh, wow, that's a really compelling metaphysical argument for God, but I don't take any. I mean, I don't think metaphysical arguments can prove anything.
Well, I
Um,
take it like what you said earlier, where you said that the prior probability is so low that it's more likely that you're mistaken about your modal beliefs than the truth of the argument. So I kind of take that position on the modal arguments for pretty much all of them in that
yeah,
sort of.
yeah. I get this objection a lot, which is people want to say, oh, I mean, I have a lot of students who are willing to believe. I love them, but they're willing to believe literally anything, so long as it sounds nothing like traditional theism. Um, and so they'll say things like, "No, I'm more comfortable with total modal skepticism. All modal beliefs are unjustified than I would with theism." I mean, there's nothing logically incoherent with this view, but I think the view is unjustified because of the role modal judgments play in our life, and because the theoretical costs of theism are relatively low. But the theoretical costs of modal skepticism, Van Inwagen, are enormous. And so your argument better be really, really compelling. And if you're just like, I don't like God stuff, that's not a very compelling argument. That's just a psychological claim about you not liking things or something.
Oh yeah, absolutely. So my argument would be that God isn't simple at all. That the asserted properties of a God are so insanely complex. It's even more so than the multiverse times infinity, because God could create infinitely many multiverses. So from my perspective, it's more likely that your modal intuitions are incorrect than that this thing is actually the necessary thing.
Yeah, see that I think you might be able to make an argument where you would do. I think Dawkins actually does this in
Don't
his
compare me to Dawkins. Oh God, his philosophy is terrible.
what?
Philosophy. I mean, because I really liked the
His philosophy is really bad. I think.
exactly. That's why I like comparing me to Dawkins. Oh, ow, it hurts.
No, 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 no. Sorry. No, he's hilarious because he's like, I hate philosophy. Here are my philosophical assumptions.
Yeah.
Okay. But whatever. But he makes an argument like, oh, the more complex the universe, the more complex the cause of the universe would have to be. Notice the causal adequacy assumption. Therefore, the more complicated our universe is, the lower the prior probability that that there is a cause of the universe, because it would have to increase in its complexity. Great argument. I mean, in terms of cleverness, I think that's a fantastic argument. I think his causal adequacy principle is dubious. I don't understand why the cause has to be complicated if the effect is, unless you just want to take that as a metaphysically obvious truth, like Descartes would.
Yeah, I
Um,
would agree with that. I wouldn't say that that is the case. I would just say that the the God that is being posited, the minimal theistic God, is itself just so complex that it is less plausible than the multiverse. So I wouldn't necessitate that the cause has to be more complicated. I just think that the theist God is more complicated by its asserted properties.
Yeah, I'm actually rather comfortable with that idea, and I may agree with you on that. And then I would just say, yeah, but at the level of modality, our only alternative is random chance. So,
Or our modal beliefs are false, right?
or we could become complete modal skeptics, I guess. Yeah. Or we could become Kantians, right? And we know nothing about the external world. Um, that would work too. I think to do that just to avoid theism strikes me as bizarre and unjustified. I do have a student who did this. They actually found my argument persuasive, which doesn't always happen. And they said, oh well, yeah, but I think I'm a Kantian now, so we can know nothing about the external world, because if we did, then I'd have to believe in God, and I'm not willing to do that. So I just think we know nothing. I don't know anything about cosmology. I don't know anything about the universe or what happens outside of our own minds. I mean, that's a logically coherent view. I just think your aversion to theism at that point is is irrational.
Well, I'm trying to make a parallel to your
Yeah.
argument earlier that essentially, like the many worlds hypothesis, where every possible logical world exists, that
Mhm.
is so counterintuitive to our modal beliefs. It's more reasonable to believe that our modal beliefs are wrong in that case, or something like that. And I want to make the same argument for God, that the logical consequences of those properties be equally as counterintuitive as just saying all possible worlds exist. Because to me, those it seems equally as ridiculous that there is this all-powerful being that can create all possible universes as there actually being all possible universes.
Hmm. Yeah, I mean, at that point, I would say no, because I think the theoretical costs of theism are a lot less.
How so?
I don't need to give up any of my core beliefs except naturalism, which is a weak belief anyway, to accept the existence of a godlike thing. Remember, I'm using more generic category. Um, Whereas for modal realism, I have to give up a huge number of beliefs, right, about conceivability as good evidence for possibility becomes questionable now. Um, not to mention that all possible me's actually exist. And again, there's lots of beliefs that I now have to change. But for theism, I don't have to change anything. I mean, I get all the scientific realism normal. I just want to say there's some sort of really weird, unique, metaphysically necessary thing. Now, how do we learn more about that thing? I don't know. That's very, very difficult. I mean, very, very difficult. But then why did the thing choose to make this universe? No idea. Well, that's not very satisfying. Nope, really unsatisfying. But there's lots of true unsatisfying things. I mean, I don't know, unless some of the prophets really are prophets from God, right? Which I think I can't rule out a priori, right? Then I have absolutely no idea how we would discover more about this entity. Maybe it can be done a priori, but I don't know. So I'm
Well,
sorry.
yeah,
Yeah.
awesome. So yeah, we've been going for like 2 hours now.
All right. Yep.
I've got to get to appointments, so I'm gonna have to wrap up pretty soon. But thanks for coming on. That was a lot of fun. It was a great conversation.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Tom.
Absolutely. Talk to you later.
Take care of yourself.
Bye.